There is a particular kind of silence that follows a great athlete when they disappear. Not the silence of retirement, not the silence of scandal. A quieter, more unsettling silence, the kind that leaves a question mark hanging over an entire season. For 116 days, that silence belonged to Carlos Alcaraz. No press conferences, no practice court leaks worth trusting, no definitive answer to the only question that mattered. Would he come back the same player who once looked destined to define this decade of tennis? 12 months ago, this was a man with 7 Grand Slam titles, a rivalry with Jannik Sinner being called the best men's tennis had produced in a generation, and a ranking that made him the most dangerous floater in any draw in the world. A tendon injury in his right wrist, the same wrist responsible for the forehand that had produced some of the most replayed shots in modern tennis, ended that momentum in a single, ordinary first-round match in April. What followed wasn't a short recovery. It was a slow unraveling that cost him 2 Grand Slams, thousands of ranking points, and, for a while, his place among the sport's top 2 players. Now, as August unfolds, Alcaraz is finally stepping back onto a competitive court, not in some low-stakes warm-up event. In Cincinnati, the exact tournament he successfully defended a year ago, in a final that ended not with a trophy celebration, but with his rival collapsing under the heat, unable to finish the match. This isn't just a comeback story. It's a return to the scene of one of the strangest, most emotionally loaded moments of his career, with a Grand Slam title defense waiting for him just 3 weeks later in New York. So we're going to do what we always do here. We're going to look past the headlines, past the hot takes, and go straight to the numbers, because the numbers tell a story more dramatic than any single quote from a press conference ever could. Over 5,000 ranking points. That's what nearly 4 months away costs a player at the top of men's tennis right now. That number alone should stop you in your tracks. But to understand what it actually means, and whether Alcaraz can realistically claw it back starting this week, we need to go back to the exact moment this all began. To understand how Carlos Alcaraz ended up here, sidelined, watching his own ranking erode in real time, we have to go back to a single, unremarkable Tuesday in April. It was supposed to be routine. A home tournament, a home crowd, an opening round match against an opponent ranked well outside the top 50. Alcaraz won in straight sets. On the surface, nothing seemed wrong. But midway through that match, something changed. A flicker of discomfort in his right wrist. The kind of thing that, in the moment, looks like nothing. A grimace, a quick shake of the hand. The kind of gesture commentators barely mention because players do it constantly. The medical term is tenosynovitis, inflammation of the tissue surrounding the tendons. It's an overuse injury, common in racket sports, and notoriously unpredictable in how long it takes to heal. It rarely announces itself with a single dramatic moment. It builds quietly, and it punishes impatience severely. 2 weeks later, Madrid, then Rome. Each withdrawal felt, at the time, like a precaution. A top player managing a minor issue, protecting himself for the tournaments that actually mattered. Then came the announcement nobody expected. Alcaraz, the reigning champion at Roland Garros, a tournament he'd won the year before in a final still being talked about, was withdrawing entirely. "This is a difficult time," he said, "but I'm sure we'll come out of it stronger." Listen closely to how he phrased that. Not, "I'll be back in 2 weeks." Not, "just a precaution." That is the language of someone who understands, deep down, that this is going to take longer than anyone wants to admit. Weeks later, Wimbledon, the tournament where Alcaraz had won back-to-back titles, the tournament that turned him into a global star, happened without him. For the first time in years, the All England Club's draw sheet didn't carry his name. And while he sat out, the sport did not wait for him. Jannik Sinner went on one of the most dominant stretches of his career, sweeping Masters 1000 titles, defending his Wimbledon crown in a grueling final against Alexander Zverev. Zverev himself broke through for his first career Grand Slam at Roland Garros, a title that, in another timeline, Alcaraz might have been defending. By the time the dust settled, the numbers told their own brutal story. Alcaraz had dropped over 5,000 ranking points. Sinner's lead over him had ballooned past 5,200, and for the first time since May of last year, Alexander Zverev had passed him in the rankings entirely. Behind the scenes, according to reports out of Spain, his recovery was treated with an almost obsessive level of caution. It started with the wrist essentially immobilized. one of the most explosive forehands in the sport, completely still. Then came left-handed drills, simply to preserve some rhythm without stressing the injury. Only gradually did light racket work return to the right hand, rebuilding stroke mechanics piece by piece. His team understood a history lesson the tennis world knows too well. Wrist injuries have ended careers, or at least permanently altered them. Thiem never fully rediscovered his pre-injury level. Del Potro's career became defined by fighting the same kind of damage, over and over, until it finally won. That is the shadow Alcaraz's team was working under for nearly 4 months of near-total silence. No press conferences, no dramatic updates, just scattered training clips and quiet reports trickling out of Spanish media. And then, this month, the silence broke. Reports out of Spain, including the newspaper La Verdad, described his wrist as fully healed. After the splint, after 2 missed Grand Slams, after watching his ranking crumble from a couch, his body had apparently given the signal his team had been waiting for. But healing and being ready are 2 very different things. And that difference is exactly what we need to examine next, because the numbers behind this comeback are more revealing and more unforgiving than most fans realize. Let's actually sit with the numbers for a moment, because they explain this comeback far better than any quote ever could. The ATP ranking works on a rolling 52-week system. Every point a player earns stays on their ranking for exactly 1 year, then vanishes, whether or not it's defended. It doesn't matter how it was earned. It doesn't care about injuries. The clock runs regardless. That means every point Alcaraz earned during his historic run last year was already, quietly, on a countdown before he ever got hurt. His Cincinnati title, his Roland Garros triumph, his US Open run, all of it sitting on a clock that doesn't pause for tenosynovitis. Here's the number that matters most. Over 5,000 points lost during the layoff. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the equivalent of an entire Grand Slam title plus 2 Masters 1000 runs. Gone. Not because he lost matches, but because he didn't play them. Meanwhile, Sinner's lead over him didn't just hold, it nearly tripled. 6 titles in the span Alcaraz was out, including a 2nd consecutive Wimbledon crown. That's not a rival standing still, waiting to be caught. That's a rival actively pulling away. And then there's Zverev, a player who, for the first time since May of last year, passed Alcaraz in the rankings entirely. Not by beating him, by simply being available to play while Alcaraz wasn't. This is the part casual fans underestimate about tennis rankings. They feel like they should reflect who's the better player. In practice, they often just reflect who showed up. Right now, for a few crucial months, Alcaraz simply couldn't. Now here's where the math gets even more unforgiving. Alcaraz isn't just returning to play a tournament. He's returning to defend one, Cincinnati, the exact title he won last year, and then, roughly 3 weeks later, defend a Grand Slam in New York, the US Open crown he took by beating Sinner himself in last year's final. History isn't especially kind to this kind of return. Players coming back from 3+ months away typically need multiple tournaments to rebuild match rhythm, the specific, competitive pressure kind of fitness that practice courts simply can't replicate. Alcaraz is attempting to compress that entire rebuilding process into a single warm-up event before defending the biggest title of his career. There is, however, a counter-argument worth taking seriously, and it comes from Alcaraz's own history. In 2023, a leg injury forced him out of the Australian Open entirely. He came back, and within months, won Wimbledon and reached the US Open final. Some players need a full season of rhythm to be dangerous. Others, evidently, need far less. And Cincinnati isn't a random re-entry point. It's a tournament he's defending, on a hard-court surface that suits his game, in the exact conditions he'll face weeks later in New York. If his team has calculated this correctly, it isn't just a warm-up, it's a controlled reintroduction to elite pressure, on terrain built for him. So the real question isn't whether Alcaraz is physically capable of playing again. His team has already answered that. The real question is whether nearly 4 months of rust can be undone in the span of a single tournament, before the sport's most demanding 2 weeks of the season begin. Every comeback in tennis creates ripples far beyond the player returning, and Alcaraz's return to Cincinnati isn't just his story. It's a story about what happens to everyone who's been building their season around his absence. Start with Jannik Sinner. For nearly 4 months, he has been playing a version of the season with 1 fewer obstacle between him and total dominance, 6 titles, a 2nd consecutive Wimbledon, a ranking lead that's nearly tripled, But dominance built in a rival's absence carries a quieter cost, one that shows up not in trophies, but in how those trophies get remembered. Tennis history rewards rivalries, not just win totals. Federer needed Nadal to be remembered the way he is. Nadal needed Djokovic. If Sinner's historic run this season is followed by an Alcaraz who returns hungry and healthy, the whole stretch gets recontextualized. Not as domination in a weakened field, but as the calm before their rivalry reignites at full strength. Then there's Alexander Zverev, a player who used this exact window to finally break through for his first Grand Slam title, and who passed Alcaraz in the rankings almost by default. Zverev now has to answer a question he's never faced before. Can he hold his new position against a returning champion with a healed wrist and a score to settle? And then there's the moment this all circles back to. Last year's Cincinnati final didn't end with a normal scoreline. Alcaraz raced to a 5-love lead before Sinner, visibly unwell, retired just 23 minutes in. Instead of celebrating, Alcaraz walked to the net and consoled him. A moment that went viral not for its drama, but for its humanity. Now imagine both of them walking back onto that same court, months later, each with something unresolved to settle. That's not just a storyline broadcasters will chase. It's the kind of moment casual fans tune in specifically to see. Because here's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of this. This year's Wimbledon final drew noticeably lower ratings than in previous years, and multiple outlets pointed directly at Alcaraz's absence as a factor. Not tennis dominance in general, specifically, the absence of this rivalry. For years, these two shared almost every Grand Slam final between them. That streak is now broken, not because either man lost his edge, but because one half of it couldn't get healthy enough to compete. If Alcaraz's Cincinnati return goes well, that streak has a real chance of resuming at the US Open. If it doesn't, men's tennis risks losing its single biggest reason for casual fans to watch at all. There's also a more personal dimension worth remembering. After a difficult Cincinnati loss back in 2024, Alcaraz smashed his racket in visible frustration, later admitting publicly that his attitude that day wasn't right, and vowing not to repeat it. It's a reminder of who he actually is underneath the highlight reels. Not a machine, but a player who feels every result, win or loss, with real intensity. That same intensity is exactly what's about to be tested again. Not against an opponent this time, but against nearly 4 months of uncertainty, a rival who's pulled dramatically ahead, and a body that has to prove, under real pressure, that it can be trusted again. So where does this actually leave Carlos Alcaraz? 4 months without a competitive match, 2 Grand Slam titles gone from his season entirely, a ranking that slipped not because he lost, but because he couldn't play. And now, a defending champion's title in Cincinnati, followed almost immediately by a Grand Slam title defense in New York, all resting on a wrist that nobody outside his inner circle can honestly say is fully tested under real pressure. 12 months ago, this was a 22-year-old who had just completed the full set of Grand Slam titles, with a rivalry against Jannik Sinner that many believed would define the next decade of men's tennis. That version of Alcaraz looked, for a moment, unstoppable. The version returning to Cincinnati is different, not diminished, but tested in a way his talent alone has never had to answer for before. This isn't about whether he can still hit the shots. It's about whether 4 months of rehabilitation, silence, and patience can actually stand up to the chaos of elite competition again. There are real reasons to believe both outcomes. History has shown Alcaraz can find his level quickly. His 2023 return from a leg injury led straight into a Wimbledon title. But history has also shown that wrist injuries, specifically, have derailed careers that looked just as promising as his. What happens over these next 3 weeks won't just decide whether Alcaraz successfully defends 2 titles. It will tell us something more permanent, whether this is the story of a champion who came back exactly on schedule, or the beginning of a longer, harder rebuilding process that reshapes the rest of his career. Carlos Alcaraz is stepping back onto a competitive court for the first time in nearly 4 months. Whatever happens next, in Cincinnati and beyond, is going to tell us more about the next chapter of men's tennis than any ranking chart ever could.